Topic today is heroism, and there's a wonderful display over at the side. Ordinary, heroic, and if you're leaving this way, make sure that you take a good look at, because it's excellent. The message right there. I looked at that this morning when I came, and I kind of thought, well, I'm not sure I need to conduct a sermon because it's right there. But in any case, make sure you have a look at that, because it's so well done. Now, throughout the Bible, especially in the great sagas that have been in the lectionary for the past few months, we have considered the challenges and difficulties involved in trying to live in harmony. There's a long ways to go. As individuals and communities, we have a lot to learn about right relationships with those different from us. Through God's grace, may we work towards finding ways to break through barriers, to walk and talk together. One of my resource books calls the story of Joseph one of the great stories of the world. It encompasses 12 chapters of Genesis, and aspects of heroism showed up in Joseph many times, from when he was sold by his brothers until the time he was able to provide for them with an escape from the famine in their homeland. Seeking to buy grain for their starving families, 10 of Jacob's sons go to Egypt and come before the governor, who happens to be their brother Joseph. Why don't they recognize him? Well, he's the last person on earth they expect to see, since he's speaking Egyptian, is dressed in the fine clothing of a high official. It just didn't seem, it didn't occur to them. However, Joseph recognizes them and creates a few situations in order to check and see if his brothers have changed over the years. And that's where this bit about Judah makes the difference. Finally, Joseph asks his entourage to leave the room. Then he speaks Hebrew, revealing his true identity. The brothers are so shocked, so surprised, that they cannot speak through the entire ordeal. Only after Joseph has told them the story and kissed them, the kiss as an important sign of forgiveness and reconciliation, then they are able to speak. Throughout the entire story, we are reminded that reconciliation is enormously powerful, yet it's also awkward and difficult and painful. Any kind of reconciliation, any form of it. On both sides, a kind of heroism, including courage, valor, and bravery. That heroism is needed. In the gospel story from Matthew, we are reminded that Jesus ignored societal and physical land boundaries and was open to making sure that all had access to God. The one exception came when in the story that we heard today, a Canaanite Gentile woman approached Jesus and asked for help for her child. Her ethnic background, her religion, and her gender all set her aside, apart from Jesus. Any one of those difficulties was enough for both of them, both the lady and Jesus, to risk censure for even conversing. But she was concerned for the welfare of her daughter, her child. She would do anything for her child. And when Jesus was uncharacteristically blunt in turning her away, she persisted. I think Jesus must have been having a bad day, because he said that the children, meaning the people of Israel, should have all they wanted instead of throwing the food, that is Jesus himself, to the dogs, meaning the non-Israelites. The woman bravely answered that even dogs are allowed to eat the children's crumbs. This interchange of conversation has always intrigued me because it proves that Jesus, although Jesus was perfect, he had a bad day. He made an error of judgment, but he allowed himself to learn from his mistakes. In today's reading, he said, "For such a reply, you may go, your request has been granted." And as always, we learn from what Jesus did. The woman had not relented until she had attained his acceptance and his compassion. He sent her on her way with what she had requested, good health for her daughter. In Mark's gospel, the same story. Now, with Mark's writing style, we are given no more details, but the Matthew account of the incident adds on, having Jesus say, "Woman, great is your faith." Another way of putting it could be, "Great is your heroism for persevering on behalf of your child." Heroism can take many forms depending on the circumstances. To bring those concepts closer to our own time, I have two stories to share that I have found to be worthwhile. They come from the internet, but I have checked them out, and the facts are true. Story number one. Many years ago, Al Capone virtually owned Chicago. Capone wasn't famous for anything heroic. He was notorious for involving the Windy City in everything from bootleg booze and prostitution to murder. Capone had a lawyer named Easy Eddie. He was Capone's lawyer for a good reason. Eddie was very good as a lawyer. In fact, Eddie's skill at legal maneuvering kept Big Al out of jail for a long time. To show his appreciation, Capone paid him very well. Not only was the money big, but Eddie got special dividends as well. For instance, he and his family occupied a fenced-in mansion with live-in help and all of the conveniences of the day. The estate was so large that it filled an entire Chicago city block. Eddie lived the high life of the Chicago mob and gave little consideration to the atrocity that went on around him. Eddie did have a soft spot, however. He had a son that he loved dearly. Eddie saw to it that his young son had clothes, cars, and a good education. Nothing was withheld. Price was no object. And despite his involvement with organized crime, Eddie even tried to teach him right from wrong. Eddie wanted his son to be a better man than he was himself. Yet, with all his wealth and influence, there were two things he couldn't give his son. He couldn't pass on a good name or a good example. One day, Easy Eddie made a difficult decision. Easy Eddie wanted to rectify wrongs he had done. He decided he would go to the authorities and tell the truth about Al Scarface Capone, clean up his own tarnished name, and offer his son some resemblance of integrity. To do this, he would have to testify against the mob, and he knew the cost would be great, but he testified. Within the year, Easy Eddie's life ended in a blaze of gunfire on a lonely Chicago street. But in his eyes, he had given his son the greatest gift he had to offer at the greatest price he could ever pay. Police removed from Easy Eddie's pockets a rosary, a religious medallion, and a poem clipped from a magazine. The poem read, "The clock of life is wound but once, and no man has the power to tell just when the hands will stop, at late or early hour. Now is the only time you own. Live, love, toil with a will. Place no faith in time, for the clock may soon be still." Story number 2. World War II produced many heroes. One such man was Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare. He was a fighter pilot assigned to the aircraft carrier Lexington in the South Pacific. One day, his entire squadron was sent on a mission. After he was airborne, he looked at his fuel gauge and realized that someone had forgotten to top off his fuel tank. He would not have enough fuel to complete his mission and get back to his ship. His flight leader told him to return to the carrier. Reluctantly, he dropped out of formation and headed back to the fleet. As he was returning to the mothership, he saw something that turned his blood cold. A squadron of Japanese aircraft was speeding its way toward the American fleet. The American fighters were gone on a sortie, and the fleet was all but defenseless. He couldn't reach his squadron and bring them back in time to save the fleet. Nor could he warn the fleet of the approaching danger. There was only one thing to do. He must somehow divert them from the fleet. Laying aside all thoughts of personal safety, he dove into the formation of Japanese planes. Wing-mounted .50 calibers blazed as he charged in, attacking one surprised enemy plane and then another, which wove in and out of the now broken formation and fired at as many planes as possible until his ammunition was finally spent. Undaunted, he continued the assault. He dove at the planes, trying to clip a wing or tail in hopes of damaging as many enemy planes as possible, rendering them unfit to fly. Finally, the exasperated Japanese squadron took off in another direction. Deeply relieved, Butch O'Hare and his tattered fighter plane limped back to the carrier. Upon arrival, he reported in and related the event surrounding his return. The film from the gun camera mounted on his plane told the tale. It showed the extent of Butch's daring attempt to protect his fleet. He had, in fact, destroyed 5 enemy aircraft. This took place on February 20th, 1942, and for that action, Butch became the Navy's first ace of World War II and the first naval aviator to win the Medal of Honor. A year later, Butch was killed in aerial combat at the age of 29. His hometown would not allow the memory of this World War II hero to fade, and today, O'Hare Airport in Chicago is named in tribute to the courage of this great man. So, if you find yourself sometime at O'Hare Airport, give some thought to visiting Butch's memorial display. Shows his statue and his Medal of Honor. It's located between Terminals 1 and 2. So, what do these two stories have to do with each other? Butch O'Hare was Easy Eddie's son. It seems to me that there are two lessons in these two stories. First, setting a good example is never easy, and it may cost you in ways you don't expect, but it is still worth the sacrifice. Two, there are many ways to be a hero. Wartime produces heroes, but so does peacetime. May God grant us the courage and grace to be a hero in someone's eyes, and the generosity to recognize heroic qualities in others. Amen.